Hi, everybody, and welcome. Tonight's February 21st, 2013, and this is Hands-on Ideas, where we interview a person that's rolling up their sleeves and actually working directly in some areas that impact us all, and has a lot to share with us about how we can explore it ourselves and what it all means. Joining us tonight is Brittany Ransom, and Brittany is an artist and professor working in very interesting media um, in both technology and in what it means to be human and alive and part of an ecosystem. So she's going to get started here. The format for this will be that she will describe some of her work. There will be links to it, and actually her presentation will be available for download and for viewing on our website after the presentation tonight, which is openlydisruptive.org. She's going to walk you through what inspires her, how she looks at what she does, which is a combination of all different kinds of media, and the conversations that provokes, and then what you can do to build on her work. And Brittany, thanks for joining us tonight. And I think I told you offline that I'm really interested in how what you do kind of gets us to rethink what it means to be an animal, whether that be a human, a domesticated animal, or what some people would even consider pests, and how
Yeah,
um,
yeah, right.
we kind of have a chance to really explore that and really see sometimes that we have some interesting notions about um, how we treat each other, how we interact with each other, and
Mhm.
what we mean to
Right.
each other. So I'm excited, and I'm going to sit back and let you get started. But if you have a question, anybody listening, you can submit them through GoToMeeting, or you can email me at dan@openlydisruptive.org, or you can tweet them to us with the hashtag HOI. Um, that said, Brittany, take it away and tell us about your body of work and kind of what you're moving towards here.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Um, I, as you said, am an artist that's working in a lot of what artists are calling now digital hybrid medias. Sometimes often referred to as new media art, though much of the context of the tools we're using aren't necessarily new because these tools change all of the time. And I create a variety of pieces that are interactive installations that are controlled either by people or by other sort of species. A lot of it is electronics based. I also make what I like to call site-specific interventions that all sort of help us think about the lines between human, animal, and the environment that we all sort of share together, and what it means that we're all sort of emerging with these new technologies. Um, I very much think about technology as a material, just as a painter thinks of paint. I think of a lot of the things as simply a material in my work, and it's, the material of our time for me in a sense. But also what that material means as far as making these relationships between us and our environment and other creatures conflicted, and also how that impacts our natural world and how we interact with it. Um, so I'm looking at ways that we can either co-evolve with this technology or also ways that this technology might not necessarily help us co-evolve. So sort of the pros and cons of both of that, and how it can sort of change the way we share our environment. My practice as an artist is relatively interdisciplinary. My background is specifically in the arts. I went to Ohio State and graduated with a degree in art and technology, and then I went to an interesting program at University of Illinois Chicago called electronic visualization, and that's where I got my master's degree. But both of which are grad degrees. It's a grad degree that focuses on collaboration with computer science, biological sciences, as well as studio arts. Um, I also think it's really important to consider this technology, and by day I'm a professor at Southern Methodist University, but I also teach a lot of workshops and summer camps with kids learning how to build, robots and working with open source code and using electronics as a material in art making, since it is something that is perceived as a material to them as younger people. I'm going to talk about a project that's relatively new, that's gained quite a bit of commentary and feedback and has received a little bit of national attention and international attention, and it's called Tweet Roach. And it's a little bit outside of the way I usually work in terms of how I consider the pest and what a pest is. And it crosses, for me, a lot of ethical lines, and I'm very much aware of that, and it's part of the process of this piece. And Tweet Roach is essentially in its very first prototyping stage. I work in a lot of series, and my pieces sometimes start in a year, and they aren't over for sometimes 5 years. So this is something that I'm just beginning to explore. It's been about a year in the making just to get it to this sort of prototype. But Tweet Roach is essentially a cockroach that I have chosen to collaborate with, albeit uninvitedly. Whether the cockroach wants to collaborate with me, sometimes I sort of doubt it. But I work with animals and insects a lot, often, and especially in the last year, that are generally perceived by the human species as a pest. And you'll see a sort of trend in a lot of the work I'm going to show you tonight here at the beginning that sort of looks at what the idea of what it is to be a pest, what that actually means. Obviously, the term pest is defined by us as human beings, and I like to think, as someone that's somewhat of a misanthrope, about the human species actually being the largest and most expansive pest, including myself. I think there's something really destructive but beautiful about the human as a pest. But thinking about what the term pest means becomes really important in this piece. So Tweet Roach, version prototype number 1, is essentially a cockroach that wears this sort of backpack that isn't produced by me. It's actually a commercial product that anybody can buy from Backyard Brains, which is linked to the Openly Disruptive site, that allows anybody at home to sort of use a cockroach to explore neuroscience at home. So it touches on a lot of those sort of ideas of the citizen scientist or biology at home. And what this backpack is sort of made of is those hex bug toys that you can actually buy at Target. It's a hacked sort of version of that circuit board. And what I chose to do with this piece is utilize all commercially available and open source materials. It's sort of it is a really important part of this project. The idea is that this cockroach it wears this backpack, which is something that I purchased, and then it is essentially controlled via Twitter, via specific hashtags, or it's attempting to control the cockroach, its physical movement. The idea is that when a specific tweet or a hashtag is sent via Twitter, the cockroach receives a microstimulation to its antenna. So it feels like, I went backwards, as if it's bumped into something or it's touched a wall. So it's the same sort of stimulation that a cockroach would feel if it sort of bumps into something, because they see sort of or feel with their antenna. But it's some custom circuitry. I have hacked this a little bit. The code, though, is all open source. I'm using processing and Arduino, which are relatively common sort of beginner applications or software applications for people to do visualization and also to create kinetic and responsive artwork. So essentially, people are allowed to use Twitter and their Twitter accounts to cooperatively try to affect the movement of this cockroach from anywhere in the world. So the idea is that it's receiving stimulation from anyone and anywhere in the world. So it's the first time I actually showed this piece was on December 7th, and it's designed to parse out specific tweets. The cockroach also isn't stimulated, or I try to not overstimulate it. It does have a rest. It only wears this backpack for about 15 minutes at a time, and it can only receive tweets about every 15 seconds. So basically, in other words, it's not necessarily that the cockroach is tricked, but it's feeling stimulation from sort of a social network that exists into its physical being or its physical network. And so thinking about, I work with insects a lot, and we're going to look at a lot of other pieces where I'm using insects as sort of what I like to consider my collaborators, even though it's uninvited. I often use them as sort of a metaphor for thinking about human life. Um, and this project became really important to me because of the sort of consumability of all of these products to make your own sort of at-home drones. This sort of technology isn't new. This sort of technology isn't anything groundbreaking. There have been actually a lot of electronic cyborgian insects that have been presented in the news lately. I think the question I'm asking is, what does it mean, one, that this technology is sort of in the hands of anyone, and two, what does it mean to sort of make this new collective mind, be it Twitter or Facebook or some sort of collective social media mind, be in control of something, or attempt to be in control of something. But most importantly, I'm also thinking about, this overstimulation that we all experience every day in our everyday lives, and how we become sort of desensitized to real life, or where the boundaries of real life and sort of our technological, social media-based life can overstimulate us. And so this idea is sort of about, can this insect be overstimulated, or is it possible for this insect to, after a while, ignore that stimulation? But this isn't a piece that's hooked up all of the time. It's only on during very specific intervals, usually for shows, and at really small intervals during that show at a time. But I recently read an article that I think is relevant, and I also have linked to the Openly Disruptive site from a book that's coming out relatively soon called Frankenstein's Cat. And it's all about cyborg technology. The Guardian article is actually a really good sort of quick lineage of how long these cyborgian animals have actually been being produced. One, by sort of governmental and scientific studies, but two, also by just regular citizens. And thinking about that, I think that there's a quote from this article that's really important, that we are heading into a world which anyone with little time and money and imagination can commandeer sort of a nervous system of a creature. And so it's a good reason to start thinking about where we draw these ethical lines. And this piece very much questions that, what are the ethical lines? Especially when you start thinking about this, as it's not a mouse, it's not a mammal, it's a cockroach. It's a cockroach that at any given time, at least in the United States, there are millions of dollars being spent on exterminating these sort of creatures, or people step on these sort of creatures. And what does it mean to sort of turn what we think as a pest into this sort of cyborg? And you have to sort of ask yourself, if you want to turn, as it says in the article, sort of want to turn at the controls, or sort of controlling this thing. So it's an interesting place to sort of start thinking about these creatures. And that article is a great place to sort of see other creatures that investigate this idea.
Brittany, it's Dan. I'd like to read that book. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this is I live in the state of Missouri, which the animal is the mule, and the state
Mm-hmm.
animal is the Missouri Mule. And we often talk about that people will become very upset about how we interact with and manipulate other species, and yet we have,
Mm-hmm.
as the state mule, a species that's really bred between, it's a chimera between two other species, and usually sterile and capable of breeding. And
Right.
that's generations old. And so I think we have a conflicted notion of what it means to interact with other species and take control like this, but then we've also been there for a long time. This isn't necessarily a 21st century phenomenon.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think thinking about that also, I think these technologies are, somewhat, not to sound like, a conspiracy theorist, but I just read an article today from IO9 that talks about these sort of circuit-based tattoos that people are going to be able to wear to use telekinesis and speak without speaking, and control things without actually having to physically move, using sort of this brain power. And I wonder what this means when this sort of technology or these ideals and ideas of control start becoming part of our own bodies, which, I already think that they somewhat are, in terms of social media and how we control trends or participate in trends, and how we use these things. But I think that sort of control hasn't necessarily been made physical, but I wonder about when this is. You know, one of my ideas has actually been to see if there's a way to let the cockroach use its nervous system to and somehow sort of create, like, control me in a way, if this is possible. So what that sort of reflexive idea means. But no, this isn't anything new. I mean, this is, in a way, I mean, I'm from a town in Ohio where it's a relatively large farm town. This to me is sort of the same ideas of control that sort of come from a farm. I think maybe the biggest question is that this is an art piece and why this piece should be relevant, and that the outcomes don't necessarily provide anything physically, you know, sort of beneficial for science or for research. But I do think it raises a lot of important questions as far as those ideas of control and ethical lines are concerned. I mean, I did recently see a piece where there are researchers that are using cockroaches to control them in the exact same way, but to find victims of natural disasters. So I wonder how people read those ideas sort of differently versus controlling this via Twitter or using this as sort of a, you know, workhorse, what the difference is between that if you really sort of sit down and think about it. So still a new piece. I'm still working on documentation and sort of more concrete research as to whether or not after it's been stimulated so many times it can still sort of use its own nervous system to ignore that overstimulation. But it's relatively new, so I thought I would talk about it first. Let's see, I think I'll move on to the next piece. I've been working with creatures that are considered by us, again, as pests for about the last 2 years, sort of specifically and intentionally. I've made a couple iterations of this piece called Around We Go, which is, it's always presented as a projection. There are two versions. It's really called Around We Go DFW, which is Dallas-Fort Worth. That's what they call the Metroplex here. I'm new to Dallas. I used to live in Chicago for a long time, so I was really used to the public transit system and not having to sort of be part of this highway systematic sort of way of travel. Then I really thought about using public transportation as the same sort of systematic approach as the highway. You're always using these sort of same trends and same travel patterns and same roadways. So I made a piece where I was using termites. It's an experimental video that basically the termites follow the lines of a Bic pen, and this is an old experiment. A lot of high schoolers use this in their science classes where they'll get a pack of termites and they'll use different types of pens to see how the termites sort of react to the pheromone of that pen or the way that pen smells. And in this case, I was sitting down and drawing live views of the Dallas-Fort Worth highway system. And the termites were following this highway system, sort of in these roads and these lines, and then they would get congested. And I was interested in looking at the way these sort of insects have their own systematic ways of approaching the way they move in space, just like we do. And in sort of this image here, you can see that they have sort of a traffic jam. And all of these things are supposed to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek and somewhat sort of funny. But I've just become obsessed with this sort of idea of commuting and what it means to commute and what it means to travel on these same sort of pathways every day. So this piece has taken a couple different forms. It's always a projection, but the first projection I did, which I'll back up here for a second, this is actually a lot bigger than it looks, happened in downtown Dallas. On one of their performing arts buildings downtown as part of a series called Aurora, where there are several artists that do projections and live interactive performances downtown. So the site of this became really specific because it's in sort of the central hub of that highway system. And the idea was that people sort of watch this and then almost see themselves or the termite as sort of a mirror of their process and how they travel these sort of same pathways over and over again. The second iteration happened, again, I'll go backwards just one slide, as a projection as part of a larger show in Chicago that was also shown with Tweet Roach that utilizes this sort of home base for where you would consider sort of termites living. So sort of a reflexive way of showing this on a human sort of architecturally built form, and then also back to a natural built form where these things might actually exist. So this is also a new piece. There's no documentation on it quite yet other than imagery, but there will be video soon. I've also been working quite a bit I've become obsessed with Twitter, and it's sort of funny because I actually don't like Twitter. I'm not an active Twitter user per se. I get on it and sort of read, but I don't necessarily post all that often. For some reason, Twitter for me is sort of this really strange space where everybody gets to share anything they want to at any given time. Sort of like Facebook, but you're limited in this use of characters. So I started this project that's ongoing 2 years ago. It's called Hashtag, and it's essentially Twitter every year will make public their year in review, which shows all of the top 20 trending hashtags of that year. And so I became really interested in how collectively, again, this idea of the collective mind across the globe, these trends sort of start to emerge. And so I took the top 5 hashtags of Twitter's 2010 year in review, the time that was the most recent year in review I had. And basically, it goes through the top topics and hashtags and celebrities and retweets. And I was most interested in the hashtags because these are something that are generally, created by people and then sort of reused. And I was taking these hashtags and having them sent to a company that produces what's called a magic message plant, which is this sort of, I don't know what just happened, this sort of hokey gift store sort of plants that you can buy as a seed, and these plants display a message after they sort of grow. So you plant the seed, and the idea is that you give it to someone and they don't know what the seed is going to say on it until it grows and it sort of emerges, and then it reveals its message. So this installation, I was using these sort of metaphorical pots or these pods that I had been working on as a series of drawings, which you can see in this slide. And I was growing these seeds, and the idea was that the lights that were above them were based on the amount of light that was given was based on how often that hashtag for these seeds were tweeted. So the idea is sort of seeing how long it literally takes for this sort of plant, this physical object, this life form to become part of the Twitter community. So how long it actually takes to grow a tweet physically on this plant as opposed to growing a tweet in the Twitter sphere. So each one of these seedlings had been modified. I had asked for this company to basically write these hashtags on these plants, and as it grows, it then becomes sort of a physical tweeting plant. And the idea is, for you to sort of consider the rate at which these things actually can grow in the physical world and the computer-based world. And then I was also thinking about if it would be possible for these to sort of become these tweeting gardens. And ideally, I would love if genetically somehow you could modify them so that after they become a garden, you could cross-pollinate these plants and sort of get new hashtags, but in the physical world. However, it's not possible at this point because this is a physical sort of change to the plant, and it's not something genetic. But it's an interesting, for me, an idea. I don't know, I'm going to have to find a scientist to work with. There's a way to sort of genetically make these things become plants that can share their genetics and sort of create their own new hashtags in a physical way based on hashtags that came from the human world. But either way, right now, they sort of exist, again, as a prototype for thinking about the growth of trends in a physical and a non-physical way.
Brittany, can you talk, how long does it take those seedlings to grow so that text can actually be seen, and how does that actually look when the plant is full sized? When it's a seedling.
Yeah, it takes about 7 to 14 days for the plant to germinate, and then to also sort of reveal, sort of scroll back in my slides, sort of reveal the text. The issue that I've been having is that since the text is sort of stamped onto the seed before you grow it, it's basically like a wound to the plant. It's sort of a physical wound. So when I grow these, it's funny, they've been getting viruses on the actual skin of the seed. And so sometimes you can read the text and sometimes you can't, which I think is sort of this idea of the virus and what that means in the real world and what that means on the computer. But it takes about 7 to 14 days before the text is shown. And then these plants can live, for years. They're what's called a sword bean. Magic Message Plant has copyrighted, their rights to sort of using these as a message or a message format or way to talk to someone or give someone a gift. But I also think it's interesting that they've taken this plant and turned it into sort of this commercial gift store, object, and it sort of loses its physicality as a real plant.
Yeah, interesting.
In the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. Prior to working on that, I was working on a larger piece for almost a year in 2011 called Partnered, We Are All Pests. And it goes back to that idea of thinking about the human as sort of the most expansive pest on the planet. And what this was it's a sonic floor installation that basically explores this idea of the definition of the term pest, and thinking about what we consider pests as potential partners for producing energy. The idea was that essentially inside of each one of those windows, and I'll give you a view of inside of the windows in that floor, are these small colonies of termites, and I'm feeding them my paper waste, or what I consider to be paper waste. So gas bills, pizza boxes, anything that's paper-based, because it has a cellulose, the termites will eventually start to eat. I even at one point fed them my birth certificate. All of these things that I thought were sort of a waste of natural resources and paper. And as these termites eat paper, they essentially release from their bodies different types of gas, two of them being sort of methane and hydrogen. And I was interested in seeing it's possible to sort of harness that hydrogen energy and use it for something useful. So a way to sort of utilize these as a partner for making different types of energy that we could use. So in this version of the piece, it's a sonic floor that's roughly 9 by 9 feet, and you can sort of see people laying on it in this image. And what's happening is that the termites are eating these small sculptures that I made out of paper that somewhat loosely mimic structures that they might actually live in the wild. And they're eating those structures, and the entire floor is there's these really small microphones in there that pick up this specific frequency of the sound of termites eating paper. And the entire floor itself becomes the speaker through vibrating transduction. There are those sort of speakers now that you can turn any surface into a speaker. So that sound is being heard in real time, and then it's being vibrated through the floor so that people can hear the termites eating. So the idea was that, you had to sort of become part of this space. You had to lay down and sort of look at the termites and spend time with something that you otherwise wouldn't necessarily be physically so close to. And that you could sort of listen to them deconstruct this paper and know that there's energy being formed. There are a few videos on my website that I've also linked to the Openly Disruptive site, where you can see sort of how this floor works, and you can also hear what the sound of these termites eating the paper sounds like. There's also a piece that's linked to this that is called H2, and it's a prototype. So that I had essentially taken a smaller colony of these termites and sent them paper, and I use a hydrogen sensor to essentially read the amount of hydrogen they're producing. So to give myself some more concrete evidence that they're actually producing these gases, and that these gases are readable and measurable. There's a visualization that comes along with that piece. But the idea really is that, one, thinking about yourself as a pest, or the human as a pest, or even what this term pest means and why we have it. And also, the way it was designed was made as the space as a gathering space to sort of talk about these things. So it's this sort of low floor that really became a space that in the show people were sort of sitting at and talking about surprisingly termites and how they're useful. And then the idea too, at a lower sort of more tangible level is that maybe these things aren't as disgusting as we think they are. They actually have a really beautiful social pattern and way of operating within our natural world that we might be able to learn something from. So I'm also looking at a lot of these creatures in a way that we might be able to sort of learn from their systematic approach to how they use material and how they function. During that same time, I was working on a piece called Host that took place at the Hyde Park Art Center in Chicago. And it was essentially a projection piece that had 4 videos and then 1 live feed that was coming from this digital microscope. And it's site-specific in that it's meant to exist on this plane that allows these really minute creatures to sort of be blown up to a somewhat human-like scale. And again, it explores this idea of sort of what does it mean to be a pest and to consciously act as a pest or unconsciously, both as a pest and then also as a host. So this is a very similar and related piece to the one before it. I was working on them at the exact same time. And I was thinking about, all of these different types of pests. Again, I'm from more of a farming town in Ohio. And, there's a lot of pest extermination happening in a lot of the crops, and then that becomes part of our food. And I started looking at these pests that are called bean beetles that essentially will make their home on different types of beans. In this installation specifically, they're mung beans, but they also eat soybeans and other types of beans that we also eat. And what these creatures do is they'll lay an egg on the bean, and then the beetles are born by eating their way into the bean, and then they eat their way out. So the bean is like their host. And when there's no more beans left, then sort of the colony has nothing else to eat or lay eggs on, and it sort of extincts itself. And so this was a metaphorical piece about thinking of the earth as a whole, or these spaces that we inhabit as sort of our own beings, and how we sort of could essentially exhaust some of our resources in the same way that these bean beetles were sort of going to exhaust their resources inside of these containers. So there were 5 containers total that sort of spanned the evolution of these creatures. So the first sort of canister of these beetles, they did exist in real time in the space, on the interior side of the projection. They were in a stage of laying eggs, and the next station of these beetles is that some were hatching, and then in the third you have more of them hatching, in the fourth you have an explosion of population happening, and they're laying eggs. And in the fifth, in this image we're looking at now, there's a live USB microscope projecting the birth of things real time on the front of the screen. And the idea is that, using projection is something that's interesting to me, in that it becomes, a tangible part of this space. It was projected at the Hyde Park Art Center, but across from there is this sort of a apartment, really large and sort of extensive apartment complex where, for me, I could imagine these sort of cyclical patterns of life and use and space happening in the same way that they were happening in these containers. So thinking about this idea of the surveillance of this parasitic thing happening interior and at this small scale, and the same sort of idea that happening across the street at this larger scale as a human, and thinking about the earth as sort of our host. After that, I worked with termites sort of exclusively in 2011, with exception to the bean beetles, and I was working on some smaller pieces. This one called How Will We Build, which the title is based off of some of the ideas found in Janine Benyus's book, Biomimicry, thinking about how we build structures and intervening or using nature or working with nature, and looking at natural structures. I had made these, I had taken screen grabs of Google Earth in Chicago at the time, which is where I was living. And I was taking the Google screen grabs of places that were highly populated that also had central sort of places that everyone knew, governmental buildings, residential buildings, specific highway systems. And I was etching those into pieces of wood. And then I was putting termites in this environment to see how they might work, went too far, how they might eat against or sort of change the way we've built an urban environment. So the idea was that the termites would either sort of eat with the humanistic path topographically, or that they would sort of create their own path, and to look at the difference between their natural path versus what humans have sort of built as their natural path. These were monitored by surveillance web cameras to capture images of the termite once every 24 hours, or actually once every 12 hours. It was about twice a day. And so I could sort of see how they might build their society or even destroy ours in comparison to how we build ours. I always like to admit when scientifically or physically I've had some failures in these pieces too. The termites, since I'm ordering them from a biological supplier, I'm not a scientist. I don't have access to a queen, so they can't repopulate themselves. So they would start eating really small patterns, and then there was no way for them to sort of repopulate themselves. So they eventually would sort of perish in these environments after they had sort of lived out their lives and didn't repopulate. So this is something that I'm still working on, but I've now sort of taken it into a three-dimensional scale, and then I'm looking at physical cities instead of just topographical views of cities. So still ongoing, but this piece, I didn't sort of get the results I was hoping to get, but the idea is still sort of there. On that same line of thinking about how we move through space, I had started working with pest beetles the year before that, which are these small beetles that exist in the woods that basically decompose rotting logs. And I became interested in these a long time ago when I had seen a science class using these as sort of this little collaborator to measure or to sort of understand how strong certain creatures are compared to others. So these beetles have this unique capability of pulling large amounts of weight relative to their body size, sort of the way that leafcutter ants can carry, these big chunks of leaves without it disrupting their sense of balance or strength. So they have this unique ability. And I started making what I was calling backpacks at the time that are really simple, that are just an LED and a watch battery. And I have these down to an even smaller sort of backpack now. And they were attached with just adhesive Velcro so that they were always removable. And I was releasing these beetles back into their sort of natural habitats and tracking their tracks, the way that they explore space, their space, how they travel together, how they travel independently. I shot them some with one beetle. This is an example of an image with just a single beetle. And then I also experimented with two beetles because they do somewhat live in, they're semi-social, they somewhat live in pairs. But I really got started on this piece because I was interested in, at the time I was GPS tracking myself and sort of where I was going and the patterns and tracks that I was making every day. And I wanted to see if myself and these creatures had any sort of similarities. And so these sort of grew out of those notions of exploration. The pieces are, there's a range of them. Again, I gave you a link in the Openly Disruptive site to look at the entire series. There's quite a few of these. The photographs take place at night. They're usually at least 3 hours long. They're anywhere between midnight and 4 a.m. I sort of take my camera and these beetles out into the woods and document the way they explore space and the way they move in space. And so it's definitely rooted in these ideas of sort of emergence and travel and formal, unrecognized sort of path making. And also, this is a continuation of my desire to collaborate with insects. I feel really drawn to them in a way, and I'm still exploring why that is. But their sort of colonies and the way they exist is really interesting to me. Prior to that, I was working with pets, a lot of people's domestic pets, and thinking about what it means, to live in a domestic space and how domesticity is different for each species, or that idea of domesticity is different. So I worked on a series, and it's still going on. I've been working on it since 2008, called Subsequent Site. Um, and what it is it's basically I've implemented this safe, wearable recording vest to dogs that allow them to sort of experience domestic space when their sort of human counterparts aren't home. So how they navigate the space and how they make decisions when there isn't sort of this companion or their sort of, owner, if you want to say that, to sort of inhibit or influence the way they experience space. So when I started working on this piece, the perspective of the dog is a little bit off for safety reasons. You can sort of see this is my dog, Lucy. The camera's to the side, and then it also has a microphone to record sound. And honestly, this piece started out of when I would leave the house. I had adopted Lucy from an animal shelter. And when I would leave, she would sort of decide she wanted to destroy certain things. And I think there's something interesting about the way, once the sort of person that's applying the rules to a space aren't there, how other creatures sort of negotiate these rules and sort of make their own. So I started recording all sorts of dogs beyond just my own. So far I've recorded 9 different dogs, all ranging in different ages, different economical statuses as far as where they live and homes, the age of their owners, the type of dog, whether they live mostly indoors or if they're more of an outdoor dog. There are a couple different videos on my website under the Subsequent Site project, which is also linked, where you can see some of these videos. And I was interested in these sort of patterns and these decisions and the lives that these creatures have when they're not necessarily tied to us. I mean, we think of domestic pets as creatures that are very much sort of ours, or they're our pets, but I think that they also very much have an independent life of outside of the way we sort of include them in our space. And so the dogs all had really different sort of outcomes. Some of them sleep for quite a bit of time. It was interesting to sort of look at how their owners' habits sort of influenced what they did. I had a couple that was in their 70s who had only a 3-year-old dog, but this dog slept more than any of the other dogs. So it's kind of interesting how they sort of adopt these personalities of their owner. But I also worked with a dog that for the most part lived outside, which are some of the stills that you're seeing here. I had gone to a residency in Steuben, Wisconsin called Acre, and there was a dog that sort of was a domestic pet, but it had the run of sort of these 10,000 acres of land. So everyone in this town knew this dog, and it was interesting to see how it had sort of made up its own daily routine. Every morning it went hunting for rabbits in this field, and then it would come back and play with this other dog, and then it would take naps, and it would catch a ride in his owner's car from the farm back to the house. So this project's become really important to me, and I think that there's something more to thinking about domestic pets. And I know that there's been a lot of cameras that have come out since then commercially for people to sort of explore this, put a collar cam on your cat to see what sort of things they're looking at, which is really interesting, and I think that we should sort of consider how these creatures that we share space with actually experience space.
It would be interesting
Um,
to also see how service animals and work animals compare to these, more casual
right,
pets. So how does a
right,
sheepdog or a
right, yeah. I haven't tried it with any service animals yet, so it's an interesting idea, because they do, they've been trained for a really specific sort of role. So yeah, I wonder how, if given the opportunity to sort of experience space without someone, I wonder what they would be like.
yeah, that is
Um,
interesting.
yeah,
Makes me think of some of the work that's being done also in image analysis where,
Mhm.
people
Yeah.
just acquiring a huge number of images to, see comparisons, to see how often do they look at other dogs' faces, or,
Right.
or
Right.
at
Right.
people, or all that kind of thing. It would,
Yeah.
to look at a
Exactly.
lot of different dogs is
Yeah. So that is something I know that they've been doing. There have been quite a bit of studies, based on like the dog's gaze and how the dog is one of the few pets, or not even pets, but animals that are able to sort of use their eyes to communicate, or the sort of muscles around their eyes to communicate different emotions. So, yeah, that would be interesting to sort of keep exploring. So these, and these are projects that are always ongoing, and the
interesting.
results for them are all very different, but um, not always scientifically conclusive. I think a lot of my pieces aren't necessarily aiming to prove any sort of science so much as they are to sort of change the way we think about approaching these animals as companions or things that we share space with. Um, Before that, I was working on this series that is meant to be sort of funny, um, with some of the same dogs that were in this series called Only in Motherhood Love. And I'm still working on these. And it's a series of people and their pets. And I photograph them outside of their home or in their home, and sort of switch their faces, their characteristics. There's that old adage that you either choose pets that look like you, or you begin to look like your pet. And I've done this with both cats and dogs. A link to most of the series is on the site, the Openly Disruptive site, and it links to my site. I'm still working on these. The ones that are up are some of the first sort of attempts at this. Um, and I photographed all sorts of different people. And then I began to start showing these on billboards, as sort of a way to think about, the way people advertise pets, and, these sort of ideas of domesticity. So I was showing them on billboards that sort of overlooked areas where I imagine people having these sort of relationships with pets. Um, and it's supposed to be really funny. Um, so what I'm working on now is sort of a continuation of the TweetWorks project. Become sort of really immersed in Twitter, and this idea of Twitter and what it means to collectively sort of make trends, and um, speak really openly about anything you want to in sort of an online format. And then I'm continuing on a lot of these projects. I have quite a few other pieces that, for the sake of time, I didn't talk about, but you can see on my website, where I'm utilizing communicating with plants, um, through vibration of voice and how they respond. Um, and I'm also working on some new kinetic pieces, which I don't have any images for, but that are also related to Twitter, that'll be coming out relatively soon. Um, but some of the things that I think are important, or important for people to think about, is sort of these methods of material, and of code and computers as a material, and what it means that we're sort of moving into this completely open source and consumable culture in terms of software and hardware. Um, this idea of sort of the hacker, and being able to be, a hacker or a biohacker, in the way that this technology and how it's always changing sort of situates species in the context of the actual natural world. I think there's a lot of instances where we lose touch of the natural world, or we lose sort of our place in it, or thinking about ourselves as an animal. Um, and so that's sort of my presentation, and be happy to answer any questions, or talk about anything in more detail.
Well, thank you very much, Brittany. That was fantastic, a really interesting body of work. As you were talking at the end, I was reminded there was a recent story that researchers have been able to sequence the DNA and tartar from skulls that they found, from on the teeth of skulls that they found going back thousands of years,
Mhm.
pre-agriculture, and they've discovered that actually um, humans living at that time had a much more diverse mouth than we did.
Uh-huh.
So,
Right, right.
so that because of we eat a very narrow range of things that compared to what people used to because of agriculture, and they were noticing just how many different kinds of bacteria there were, and they were making the comment that it's interesting that agriculture has possibly made it because of these near monocultures that your mouth is actually in this kind of permanent state of being a dysfunctional ecosystem that
Mhm.
that decay and everything are really a result of a unhealthy ecosystem. So it's interesting to just see people starting to think about how we relate to other species in that kind of way. So,
Right, right.
so it's great. A couple of questions I had for you. The first one was, when you were talking about, and I'm sorry I forget the piece, but with the termites and producing the hydrogen, and
Yeah.
uh, what is that piece called? I'm sorry.
It's called partnered we all test.
Right. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. You alluded a little bit to biomimicry, the idea of humans designing things to, take advantage of the intelligence in nature, whether how
Mhm.
things have evolved or whatever. And interestingly, there's a lot of research going on biofuels about termites and trying to find
Right.
out um, and maybe you can probably speak a little bit better about this than I can, but actually, termites are one of the few creatures that can metabolize cellulose, which is the most of what plant matter is. And so, for us to actually have biofuels that are plant based, we're going to have to learn how the enzymes that work in a termite actually could work for us. So, there's some interesting
Exactly.
corollaries there.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually how I got started working with that piece. It's for me, it's pretty distant. I'm trying to find scientists to collaborate with me on sort of how we can then harvest that energy. But I got started in that piece because I began reading about the government's exploration of looking at biofuels, and I had read this one blip on the EPA's website about termites being able to eat a single piece of paper, like an 8 by 11 piece of paper, and produce, as they said in this article, up to 2 liters of hydrogen. Um, how much
That's
power, if
amazing.
things were hydrogen power, that might be able to produce. And so exactly what you just said in thinking about, looking at how termites' bodies break down cellulose, and if it would be possible to sort of re-engineer a lot of our waste is paper-based, and if
Hmm.
it's possible to take that sort of paper and use either, maybe not even use, but somehow collaborate with termites, or, as you mentioned, biomimicry, finding a way that can mimic the internal organs of termites to produce this type of fuel is something I'm really interested in. I don't know how to scientifically do that, but I do think that it's 100% possible. How economical that may be, I'm not sure, but I feel like we all know that we're in sort of an energy crisis, so I think it's worth exploring. Or at least, this piece is sort of a gesture to get people who haven't even thought about these sort of ideas in that space of thinking about, looking at natural systems that already function and exist and function really well. How we might be able to sort of borrow ways that those systems work to sort of help ourselves. Um,
Right.
and
Well,
then,
I'm sorry, I
go ahead.
interrupted you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then thinking, beyond ourselves as sort of this all-knowing species of a creature, and how I think, there have been creatures like termites that have existed for, millions of years that have already sort of figured out how to navigate the environment and how to make use of things in a sort of appropriate way. And I think there's a sense of that not being important sometimes as humans. So.
A question came up from your work with tracks
Uh-huh.
with these beetles, and I think you mentioned that they typically are only one or two, usually together. Have you thought about exploring how that would work with something that's a more social insect, and exploring kind of some, we start to hear a lot more about like how bees, the intelligence of the collective in finding things and sharing information.
Right.
Have you thought about anything about extending that to a more social insect, and
Yeah.
how would that work?
Yeah, I have. I've been interested in bees for a while, and I've actually been taking some beekeeping classes to sort of learn more about bees. There's something that, I know that they're social, and same with ants and termites are all these sort of social organisms. And I have thought about that as ways of sort of tracking the way that they move and function within space and how they, how they exist together. I'm not sure. I sort of started that project thinking about creatures that were capable of sort of collaborating with me without, the ethical sort of question. It's really hard for me, even with the Twitter roach, attaching something to these things is, it's not my goal to sort of hurt them. And so bees, I don't know enough about, but I would be curious to see if it's possible to track them in a similar way, if there's some sort of attachment that they can handle carrying, or even if there's a way you could use pollen as sort of a tracking device. But I thought about that, but I don't know how I would, or how
Yeah,
physically that
it's
would happen.
interesting. Somebody's been doing that because you see these things about it, and I don't know if it's little RFID tags or what, but there's
Mhm.
a interesting project, an artist here near me. There's a old public housing project that was actually imploded in the 70s just because of how it had gotten kind of out of control and problems with crime um,
Mhm.
and everything. And it's a really fascinating story. It's called Pruitt-Igoe. And an artist, Juan William Chavez, is actually, the site has never been redeveloped and it's gradually become overgrown. And he's proposing to put beehives in there to kind of rethink what that might be. And, he's got an, interesting parallels between a housing development, a high-rise housing development, and beehives, and how
Right.
the bees are social and everything. But would be interesting to do that. It's at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
He would look at it as a little bit more social commentary, which I think is interesting.
Mhm.
What about you talked about with the bean beetles? That you kind of just touched on briefly, that the bean beetles, that once they exhaust their food source, they become extinct. As far as they know.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
any other thoughts about how um, that end of life works in other works? What that speaks to. That's pretty powerful because to that bean beetle, as far as it knows, it's the last one, and it
Right.
is
Right.
extinct as a species. Have you thought about exploring end of life in any other ways?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I do think, hmm, that's a tough thought about that. This idea of sort of their, as far as they know, that they're the last sort of, creature in that space. Um, that piece is, in a way, that idea of the end of time or the end of a species is supposed to be sort of the ending metaphor, because over time, that piece stops generating itself, those beetles stop regenerating themselves. And I really, without being such, a downer, I really think that this is what's going to essentially, it could happen to us, in a way that sort of everything else around us will become extinct, and so we'll be sort of this last species left until we aren't here anymore either. Or at least that's the idea that the piece sort of points to. Um, and so I don't, and that notion of being aware, I don't think, I don't know for sure. I don't know scientifically, how aware these creatures are, um,
Sure, sure.
of that idea, but um, I
But we
think that
we
it
certainly
should
project that
be,
onto
and
them,
it,
don't we?
right, yeah, right, right. So I don't know, but I think that, the purpose of that is, though, to make us aware of the possibility of sort of extincting what I think of as our sort of host, or our spaces, and our spaces that we share with other things similar to us or other people, um, and
That's
what it means
powerful.
to sort of keep eating at our host.
Right. Well, and of course, you also point to some of the things where ecosystems are much richer than that, and they kind of reinforce each other rather than just.
Right,
Um,
right, right.
but speaking of ends, we're nearly at the end of our time. But to end on a little bit more of an up note, I just want
Yeah,
to remind everybody that if you go to openlydisruptive.org, um, there's a page with all of the links that Brittany has talked about, with a copy of her presentation, and also an archive of this webcast, and links to everything on it. And I just want to pose a question. Don't want to put you on the spot, but rather than thinking about the end, think about a little bit about collaboration and how people could work with this with you on this. And you've got some very powerful, thought-provoking kinds of ways of thinking about our relationship to the rest of the world. Talk a little bit about what collaboration might look like for you with a larger community of people doing this. I guess put yourself in the shoes of the Impressionists in France, and there's suddenly a movement of people doing work like this with you. What does collaboration look like, and what areas are you able to, or people exploring? Um,
Yeah, that's a great question because I mean ultimately in the end I do hope and I think that through these new sort of forms of technology and the availability of these spaces that are exploring science and artistic practice and energy based practices, I do really think that we are at sort of a pinnacle point where people are beginning to collaborate and are interested in genuinely sort of figuring out ways of working together for the betterment of our societies. And as far as collaboration is concerned, I think that we're at a really important time where, because this technology makes it so available, it's possible for an artist to work with a scientist, for a scientist to work with a computer scientist, and when you put sort of those minds together, with like a group of, your neighbors, with your neighbors and with other people who might be builders. I think we're in a unique time in which there are a lot of people that can sort of hone in all of their skills to look at some of these larger social issues and environmental issues that we're facing. So, I'm interested in sort of community spaces that, want this sort of collaboration to happen. I feel like all sorts of even, not necessarily small not in a demeaning way, but there are a lot of spaces that are happening in like community gardens and thinking about, how to use space together, how to approach science together from from a more reachable and tangible standpoint for everyone. And same with this sort of open source way of sharing with technology and how it makes all of this shareability possible. So for me, collaboration, be it with insects or be it with scientists or children, even to think about the way that they approach space and the way that they approach, social issues is really important, and it's imperative to my practice. And I think we live in a unique time where we can really take advantage of it because of sort of technology that we have.
well, great. Thank you very much, Brittany. And this will all be available on our website, but this has been very thought provoking, and I think helps us all open our eyes to a lot of different ways to think about how we fit into the larger world and universe. So thank you very much for your time tonight.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we will be back next month with another session of hands-on ideas, and we will be starting to actually distribute a discussion guide. So Brittany, you just mentioned the idea of these public spaces, these maker spaces or labs or studios where people are gathering to work on these interesting things. And actually, you can stream these hands-on ideas webcasts. And if you would like, we will post that on our website that you're having a meetup there to see that. And we'll actually
Okay, great.
send folks a discussion guide so that they can be prepared for having a good discussion after the webcast,
Okay,
like I'm
yeah,
sure
that's
folks will be
great.
after this one. So
Okay, great. Yeah,
thank you very much. And um, thank you very much for attending Hands on Ideas. And we'll see you again
yeah,
next
thank
month.
you.
Take care. Bye bye.
Thanks. You too. Bye.